On March 3, 1943, at 0800 hours near the Bismarck Sea, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shiratsuyu. He commanded 8 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most seasoned destroyers, tasked with escorting 8 transport ships. These vessels were laden with 6,900 troops, critically needed at Leh. Kimura gazed at the morning sky over the Solomon Sea with mounting apprehension. His radar operators possessed no equipment capable of detecting the approaching threat. He was entirely unaware that American B-25 Mitchell bombers, skimming the wavetops, had been transmuted into a force his naval training had never prepared him for. These were Strafer gunships, armed with more forward-firing machine guns than an entire squadron of fighters. In the ensuing 15 minutes, they would demonstrate precisely why every assumption the Imperial Navy held regarding bomber attacks was catastrophically flawed. The convoy had departed Rabaul on February 28, 1943. Kimura, flying his admiral's flag from the Shiratsuyu, led the destroyers Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo. Each of these vessels was a Guadalcanal veteran, having survived the brutal night engagements in Iron Bottom Sound. They were escorting 8 transports carrying the 51st Infantry Division, under the command of Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura. These troops could tip the scales in New Guinea if they reached Leh. Kimura understood the risks. He had studied the war games at Rabaul, which predicted 40 to 50% losses from Allied air attacks. However, Imperial General Headquarters had deemed such losses acceptable if half the convoy reached its destination. The alternative was to witness the Allies systematically dismantle Japanese positions along the New Guinea coast without any reinforcements. What Admiral Kimura did not know, and could not possibly know from his vantage point on the Shiratsuyu's bridge that morning, was that 500 meters south at Port Moresby, General George Kenney of the 5th Air Force had spent the past 3 months radically transforming his B-25 Mitchell bombers. He was assisted by a former Navy Chief Petty Officer named Paul Irvin Gunn, known to all as Pappy. Gunn had taken standard medium bombers and turned them into flying battleships. He installed 4 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, where the bombardier's position once was. 4 more were added in blister packages on the fuselage sides, beneath the cockpit. This created a concentrated wall of firepower, capable of clearing a destroyer's deck in mere seconds. Furthermore, he perfected a technique called skip bombing. In this method, aircraft would approach at mast height, 200 feet or less, and bounce their bombs across the water, much like skipping stones, to impact the sides of ships. These modifications began after Kenney arrived in Australia in the summer of 1942. He had discovered his bomber force was achieving a dismal 3% accuracy rate against Japanese shipping, watching helplessly as convoy after convoy delivered troops and supplies to sustain Japanese operations. Then, Pappy Gunn, a 52-year-old former enlisted naval aviator who had been flying in the Philippines when war broke out, convinced Kenney that the problem wasn't the bombing itself, but the approach. He argued that attempting to hit moving ships from 5,000 feet was futile. They needed to get down to deck level and deliver their ordnance at point-blank range. This, in turn, necessitated suppressing the anti-aircraft fire that would inevitably tear apart any bomber making a low-level run. In short, it meant more guns, significantly more guns than any bomber had ever carried before. Guns started with the A-20 Havocs of the 3rd Attack Group, installing 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. He scavenged weapons from wrecked fighters, as official channels couldn't supply them fast enough. He rigorously test-fired the installations until he discovered that the muzzle blast from guns mounted behind the propeller arc would peel the skin off the fuselage. This forced him to extend the barrels with blast tubes that reached past the propellers. Solving one problem only led to another. The concentrated firepower of the 4 nose guns threatened to crack the aircraft's structure, requiring reinforcement plates and shock-absorbing mounts. Each solution presented new challenges that Gunn tackled with the determination of a man who had lost his family to Japanese imprisonment in the Philippines. By December 1942, Gunn had moved on to the B-25 Mitchells, a larger aircraft capable of carrying more guns and ammunition. Working at the Townsville Modification Depot with mechanics from the 38th Bomb Group, he cut away the greenhouse nose designed for a bombardier and installed a short, solid nose packed with 4 50 caliber machine guns. He then added the blister packages on the fuselage sides, which would give the design its distinctive appearance. Each package contained 2 more 50 caliber guns with 400 rounds per gun. Ammunition boxes were mounted inside the fuselage, equipped with blast shields to protect them from muzzle flash. Test pilots reported that firing all 8 forward guns simultaneously felt like hitting a brick wall in midair. The recoil actually slowed the aircraft's forward speed. The first combat test occurred in January 1943, when modified B-25s attacked a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Leh. They achieved hits, but not the decisive results Kenny desired. This led to further refinements in tactics, with pilots practicing skip-bombing runs against the wreck of the SS Pruth, a freighter that had run aground on a reef near Port Moresby in 1924. Through trial and error, they learned that the ideal approach was to come in at 200 feet altitude and 300 miles per hour, dropping to mast height at 600 yards from the target. They would then release a stick of 4 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses at 300 yards. The bombs would skip across the water to strike at or below the waterline, while the pilot pulled up and over the target, clearing the ship's superstructure by mere feet. These practice runs were not without casualties. One B-25 collided with the Pruth's mast during a training run. Another was damaged by fragments from its own bombs detonating too close, and several aircraft returned with pieces of the target vessel's structure embedded in their wings and fuselages. But by late February 1943, the 5th Air Force possessed dozens of modified B-25 Strafers with crews trained in skip bombing. They coordinated with Australian Beaufort fighters, which would suppress anti-aircraft fire with their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, creating a deadly combination that was about to be unleashed upon Admiral Kimura's convoy. Meanwhile, across the globe in the Atlantic, German U-boat commander Captain Werner Henke, commanding U-515, had just received reports from Naval High Command regarding increasing Allied air patrols. These patrols were making traditional surface operations increasingly dangerous, forcing submarines to remain submerged for longer periods, which reduced their speed and effectiveness. New long-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator were closing what had been the mid-Atlantic gap, where U-boats could operate beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. Admiral Karl Dönitz at U-boat headquarters in France studied the loss reports, which showed that Allied aircraft were becoming devastatingly effective at catching U-boats on the surface, particularly the modified bombers equipped with powerful searchlights and depth charges. The German submarine force had entered 1943 with confidence, having sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in 1942. Their Wolfpack tactics involved coordinating multiple submarines to overwhelm convoy escorts. However, the introduction of escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and improved radar was beginning to shift the balance. U-boat losses climbed from 27 in 1940 to 87 in 1942. This trend accelerated in early 1943 as Allied aircraft, equipped with new centimetric radar that German detection equipment couldn't sense, caught surfaced U-boats by surprise. Experiments with flak U-boats, submarines equipped with heavy anti-aircraft armament designed to fight it out on the surface with attacking aircraft, proved that remaining surfaced against determined air attack was suicide. In the Mediterranean, Italian naval commanders at La Spezia and Taranto were still recovering from the psychological shock of witnessing their battle fleet decimated by British carrier aircraft at Taranto in November 1940. Swordfish biplanes, seemingly obsolete fabric-covered relics from an earlier era, had delivered torpedo attacks that sank or crippled 3 battleships in harbor, demonstrating that the age of the battleship was ending. Air power could reach anywhere and strike anything, and the Regia Marina's lack of aircraft carriers and effective radar would prove fatal in a war increasingly dominated by aircraft. This was a lesson reinforced every time Allied bombers appeared over Italian naval bases, forcing ships to scatter to avoid the fate of sitting ducks at anchor. Admiral Angelo Iachino, commander of the Italian battle fleet, had written in his war diary about the frustration of operating in the Mediterranean without air cover. He described how Allied aircraft would shadow Italian task forces for hours, radioing their positions to submarines and surface units, making surprise impossible and turning every sortie into a potential ambush. The few Italian aircraft available for naval cooperation lacked the range and equipment for effective reconnaissance, leaving Italian commanders blind while their enemies saw everything. This disparity had resulted in disasters like Cape Matapon, where British carrier aircraft had crippled the battleship Vittorio Veneto and enabled the destruction of 3 heavy cruisers in a night action. Back in the Bismarck Sea, as the morning of March 3, 1943, progressed, Admiral Kimura received reports from his escorting Zero fighters that American B-17 flying fortresses were approaching at high altitude. This was the type of attack the Japanese had prepared for. His destroyers took evasive action, and anti-aircraft guns elevated to their maximum range. The convoy turned to present the smallest possible target as bombs began falling from 20,000 feet. Most splashed harmlessly into the sea. As expected, however, one transport took a direct hit that started fires below deck. It was manageable damage that the ship's crew could control, nothing that would stop the convoy from reaching Leh the next morning. But at 1000 hours, Kimura's lookouts reported something different. Aircraft approaching from the south at extreme low altitude. They were so low, they were difficult to spot against the ocean's surface, their engine noise masked by the convoy's own machinery until they were almost upon them. As the first wave of B-25 Strafers and Australian Beaufort fighters swept in, Kimura experienced a moment of incomprehension. These aircraft were not behaving like any bombers in Japanese naval doctrine. They were coming straight at his ships at masthead height. Suddenly, the air filled with streams of 50 caliber tracers as the 8 forward-firing guns on each B-25 opened up simultaneously. The concentrated firepower swept across the Shiratsuyu's deck like a scythe. The Japanese had never encountered anything like this concentrated strafing attack. As each B-25 Strafer unleashed over 3,000 rounds per minute from its 8 forward guns, armor-piercing and incendiary rounds punched through the destroyer's light anti-aircraft shields, through the deck plating, through anything in their path. Gun crews, who moments before had been tracking high-altitude bombers, were literally blown apart by the concentrated fire. Their 25mm anti-aircraft guns, designed to engage aircraft at altitude, were unable to depress low enough to target aircraft skimming the wavetops, leaving only small-caliber machine guns to respond. Their fire was ineffective against the B-25's armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. Lieutenant Commander John Henter, leading the first wave of B-25s from the 90th Bombardment Squadron, later described the attack run. We went in so low that the prop wash was throwing up spray behind us, 8 ships ahead, spread across the sea. And as we opened up with all guns, you could see our tracers walking across the water and up the side of the transport, across the deck, where men were running for cover that didn't exist, the incendiary rounds flashing as they hit. And at 300 yards, we pickled our bombs. Pulled up hard to clear the masts, and looking back, saw the bombs skip once, twice, then slam into the hull right at the waterline. The skip bombing technique that Pappy Gunn and the 5th Air Force had perfected turned every B-25 into a precision weapon. Pilots who had trained against the Pruth dropped their bombs exactly where they wanted them. The 500-pounders, with their 5-second delay fuses, punched through the thin hull plating of the transports before detonating inside. The explosions were contained by the ship's structure, magnifying the destructive effect. Near misses that detonated alongside created massive water hammers that crushed hull plates and sprung seams, flooding compartments faster than damage control could respond. Within the first 3 minutes of the attack, the transport Kakuzimarui took 4 direct hits from skip bombs and began listing heavily to port. Her captain ordered abandonment of the ship as ammunition in her forward holds began exploding, sending debris hundreds of feet into the air. Meanwhile, the Tio Maru, struck by incendiary rounds from strafing Beaufort fighters that ignited fuel barrels lashed to her deck, became an inferno that spread faster than her crew could fight it. Men jumped overboard to escape the flames, only to be machine-gunned in the water by following aircraft, a tactic the Allies had adopted after Japanese fighters had strafed American aircrew in parachutes earlier in the war. Admiral Kimura, on the Shiratsuyu's bridge, watched in horror as his carefully arranged defensive formation disintegrated. Destroyers that should have been providing anti-aircraft coverage were fighting for their own survival, as B-25s assigned to each warship made repeated strafing runs, their 8 forward guns turning upper decks into charnel houses. Skip bombs aimed at the destroyer's engine rooms threatened to cripple their ability to maneuver. Through the chaos, he could see more waves of aircraft approaching, B-25s at low level, B-17 at medium altitude, Australian Beaufort fighters sweeping in from different angles. A coordinated attack that gave his gunners no single threat to focus on. The destroyer Arashio took 3 direct hits from skip bombs that destroyed her engine room and started uncontrollable flooding. Her captain attempted to beach her on a nearby reef before she sank, but another wave of B-25s caught her dead in the water. Their strafing runs killed most of the damage control parties trying to save the ship. The destroyer Tokitsukaze, hit by bombs that detonated in her forward magazine, simply disappeared in a massive explosion that threw debris onto ships 500 yards away, taking down Army Commander General Adachi Hatazo and his entire staff who had been aboard. By 1300 hours, just 15 minutes after the first low-level attack began, 7 of the 8 transports were sinking or sunk. The 8th was mortally wounded and abandoned. 4 of Kimura's 8 destroyers were either sunk or sinking. The admiral himself was wounded by machine gun fire that had raked the Shiratsuyu's bridge. His flagship's stern was blown off by a bomb explosion that detonated her depth charges. As he transferred his flag to the destroyer Shikinami, Kimura could see hundreds of men in the water, some clinging to debris, others simply floating face down. The sea around the shattered convoy turned red with blood as sharks, attracted by the carnage, began attacking survivors. The Japanese Navy's after-action report, compiled from survivor accounts, described the attack as unlike anything they had encountered in the war. It cited the combination of overwhelming firepower from the strafing runs that suppressed all defensive response, followed immediately by precision skip bombing that placed bombs exactly where they would do the most damage. The entire attack was so coordinated that ships trying to aid stricken vessels became targets themselves. Rescue operations were impossible under the continuous air assault that lasted through the morning as Allied aircraft returned to Port Moresby, rearmed, refueled, and came back for additional attacks on any vessel still afloat. Captain Tamichihara, commanding the destroyer Matsukaze in another convoy, would later write about the reports that reached the Japanese fleet after the Bismarck Sea disaster. He described the shock that ran through the Imperial Navy at the completeness of the destruction. He noted that not a single soldier of the 51st Infantry Division reached Leh, and that the vaunted destroyer escorts that had dominated the Solomon Islands night battles were helpless against this new form of air attack. Most disturbing was the realization that the Americans had developed these tactics specifically to counter Japanese naval operations, transforming their bombers into anti-shipping weapons that could strike anywhere within range of their airfields. At Rabaul, the Japanese Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters Staff Officer Commander Masatake Okumiya recorded the impact of the battle. Our losses for this single battle were fantastic. Not during the entire savage fighting at Guadalcanal did we suffer a single comparable blow. We knew we could no longer run cargo ships, or even fast destroyer transports to any front on the north coast of New Guinea, east of Wewak. The Americans had achieved complete air superiority, and their new tactics made surface vessels virtually defenseless. The myth of the destroyer's speed and maneuverability protecting it from air attack died in the Bismarck Sea. The battle's impact rippled far beyond the Southwest Pacific. Allied air forces in other theaters studied the success of the B-25 Strafer modifications and skip bombing tactics. General Kenny, promoted and decorated for the victory, pushed for more B-25s to be modified to the Strafer configuration, eventually seeing the factory-produced B-25J model incorporate 8 forward-firing 50 caliber guns as standard equipment, with some variants carrying up to 18 machine guns total, including top turret, waist, and tail positions, creating flying gunships that would devastate Japanese shipping throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. In Germany, Admiral Dönitz received intelligence reports about the Bismarck Sea battle through Japanese naval attachés. He noted with concern the effectiveness of concentrated aerial strafing against surface vessels, a tactic that could be equally devastating against U-boats caught on the surface. Within weeks of the battle, new orders went out to U-boat commanders, emphasizing the need to crash dive at the first sign of aircraft, abandoning any attempt to fight it out on the surface. Resources were poured into developing snorkels that would allow submarines to run on diesel engines while submerged, reducing their vulnerability to air attack. The U-boat force's Black May, a period of intense losses, was only 2 months away when the combination of long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and improved Allied tactics would result in the loss of 41 U-boats in a single month, forcing Dönitz to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. He admitted in his war diary that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost, that aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges had made the traditional U-boat warfare of surface attacks and wolfpack tactics obsolete. This was occurring just as the B-25 Strafers had made traditional surface convoy operations obsolete in the Pacific. Italian naval commanders, studying both the Bismarck Sea battle and the increasing effectiveness of Allied air attacks in the Mediterranean, recognized that without aircraft carriers and modern radar, the Regia Marina was effectively neutralized, confined to port, or restricted to operations under the cover of land-based aircraft that were themselves being steadily destroyed by Allied bombing. Naval resupply missions to North Africa became exceedingly perilous. Modified bombers, employing similar low-altitude attack strategies, inflicted severe damage on Italian merchant shipping. This forced a reliance on submarines and swift smaller craft for supply runs, which proved insufficient to sustain the North African campaign. The technological advancements pioneered by Papillon in the modification workshops of Townsville, which transformed standard medium bombers into formidable Strafer gunships, signified a profound alteration in naval combat. These modifications demonstrated that appropriately equipped and deployed aircraft possessed the capability to dominate surface vessels, irrespective of their speed, armor, or defensive armaments. This revelation was starkly illustrated in the Bismarck Sea, where oil slicks and debris marked the watery graves of an entire Japanese convoy. This convoy was annihilated within 15 minutes by modified bombers, which represented a fraction of the cost in resources and personnel of a single destroyer. General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater, lauded the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as the war's decisive aerial engagement in that region. He noted its crucial role in securing the northeastern coast of New Guinea from Japanese reinforcement, thereby enabling the subsequent Allied advance that would eventually lead to the liberation of the Philippines. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was even more significant than the tangible material losses. Aware that any maritime movement within range of Allied airfields courted near certain destruction, they were compelled to resort to submarines and barges operating under the cover of night, which were inadequate to maintain their scattered garrisons. The B-25 Strafer design underwent continuous refinement throughout 1943 and 1944. Later iterations incorporated a 75mm cannon alongside its machine guns. However, numerous pilots favored the pure gunship configuration, finding the concentrated firepower of multiple 50-caliber machine guns more effective than a single, larger-caliber weapon. Tactics refined from the Bismarck Sea experience involved B-25s operating in coordinated strikes, with fighters neutralizing aerial opposition, strafers dismantling anti-aircraft defenses, and skip bombers delivering the decisive blows. This integrated arms approach relentlessly devastated Japanese shipping until the war's conclusion. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Gunn, who received promotions and commendations for his inventive contributions, continued to develop new modifications and tactics until his untimely death in a plane crash in October 1957. His enduring legacy is evident in the thousands of Japanese vessels sunk by Strafer gunships, in the doctrine of low-altitude anti-shipping attacks that became a global standard for air forces, and in the fundamental principle he unequivocally proved that with sufficient forward-facing firepower, a bomber could be transformed into an effective ship killer, overwhelming any defense through sheer volume of fire. This principle was demonstrated with devastating clarity during those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea. The official history of the Japanese Navy, compiled post-war, identified the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as the pivotal moment when Japan lost effective control of the sea lanes to New Guinea, forcing them onto the strategic defensive for the remainder of the conflict. Individual ship captains and convoy commanders were plagued by nightmares of low-flying B-25s appearing unexpectedly, their 8 guns blazing. They understood that their anti-aircraft weaponry, designed for high-altitude bombers, was impotent against aircraft attacking at low altitudes. Their speed and maneuverability became irrelevant when the enemy could deploy a veritable wall of lead across their path. Within the broader context of World War II, the triumph of the B-25 Strafers underscored that innovation and adaptability could triumph over numerical and material disadvantages. It highlighted how a 52-year-old former enlisted man, working with salvage parts in a modification depot, could devise tactics and technologies that would irrevocably alter the war's trajectory. It proved that the synergy of skip bombing and concentrated forward firepower could transform a medium bomber, originally intended for level bombing from high altitudes, into one of the war's most potent anti-shipping weapons. This metamorphosis caught the Axis powers entirely off guard. The sole survivor from Admiral Kimura's staff, who was rescued by the destroyer Shikonami after the Shiryuki sank, would later provide testimony at war crimes trials. He recounted how the American bombers seemed to materialize from nowhere. Flying so low, they appeared to rise from the sea itself. Their nose guns illuminated like welding torches as they closed in, the roar of their engines drowned out by the deafening thunder of 50 caliber rounds tearing into steel. The bombs then skipped across the water with an almost playful bounce before slamming into the holes with catastrophic effect. The entire assault was so swift, so meticulously coordinated, and so overwhelming that any form of defense was rendered utterly impossible. The effectiveness of the B-25 Strafers was repeatedly validated throughout 1943 and 1944. At Wewak, they destroyed 60 aircraft on the ground and sank numerous vessels in harbor. In the Philippines, they thwarted Japanese attempts to reinforce Luzon. In the Netherlands East Indies, they rendered Japanese coastal shipping unviable. Each success built upon the hard-won lessons from the Bismarck Sea, leading to refined tactics and improved modifications. By the war's conclusion, the mere sight of B-25s approaching at low altitude was sufficient to compel Japanese crews to abandon ship, rather than face inevitable annihilation. German naval attachés in Tokyo, in their reports on the Bismarck Sea battle and its repercussions, issued warnings that similar tactics could prove devastating if deployed in the Atlantic or Mediterranean theaters. They noted that the concentration of forward firepower demonstrated by the B-25 Strafers surpassed any armament mounted on existing naval vessels for anti-aircraft defense. The combination of strafing to suppress defenses, followed by skip bombing to deliver the fatal blows, represented a tactical innovation that rendered surface vessels obsolete in areas within the reach of enemy air power. These were prophetic warnings, as Allied air forces subsequently adopted analogous tactics globally. The Italian Navy's experience in the Mediterranean mirrored that of the Japanese in the Pacific. Allied aircraft, armed with forward-firing cannon and rockets, decimated convoy operations bound for North Africa, compelling the Italians to attempt supply runs with submarines and small, fast craft that were inadequate to sustain military operations. Meanwhile, the few remaining major surface units remained confined to port, relying on whatever air cover could be mustered. They understood that venturing out meant facing the same fate as Kimura's convoy, destruction from the air, against which no effective defense existed. As 1943 progressed and news of the Bismarck Sea battle disseminated through military channels worldwide, naval planners commenced a reassessment of fundamental assumptions regarding surface warfare. They acknowledged that the era of the battleship and even the destroyer as the supreme masters of the sea was drawing to a close. They recognized that appropriately equipped aircraft possessed the capability to dominate any surface vessel, and that the B-25 Strafers had conclusively proven that air power could not only sink ships, but could do so with an efficiency and economy that rendered traditional naval operations unsustainable. This was a lesson that would profoundly shape naval development for decades to come. The pilots who flew the B-25 Strafers during the Bismarck Sea battle would go on to become some of the war's most decorated aviators. Their success inspired an entire generation of low-altitude attack specialists who would perfect the art of ship killing from the air. Concurrently, the maintenance crews who had collaborated with Poppy Gun to install the gun packages and structural reinforcements became experts in field modifications, adapting aircraft to specific mission requirements. This inherent flexibility granted Allied air forces a decisive advantage over their more rigid adversaries. Ultimately, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented more than just the destruction of a Japanese convoy. It signified a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Pacific, demonstrating that properly applied air power could control sea lanes more effectively than surface fleets. It proved that innovation and adaptation could overcome traditional military advantages, and that a handful of modified bombers, crewed by determined aviators, could achieve what entire naval task forces had failed to accomplish. The complete annihilation of enemy shipping occurred within minutes, not hours or days. The legacy of the B-25 Strafers extended far beyond World War II, influencing the development of dedicated ground attack aircraft, such as the A-10 Thunderbolt II, with its formidable forward-firing cannon. It firmly established the principle that concentrated forward firepower could overwhelm any point defense system. A principle definitively demonstrated in those 15 devastating minutes over the Bismarck Sea when Admiral Kimura witnessed his entire convoy vanish beneath the waves. They were victims of an innovation that had transformed medium bombers into the deadliest ship killers of the Pacific War. For the Japanese Navy, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked an irreversible turning point. It compelled them to abandon any hope of resupplying their New Guinea garrisons via surface convoy, condemning those forces to slow starvation and eventual defeat. The psychological impact of the complete annihilation of an entire convoy, protected by 8 destroyers, sent shockwaves through the Imperial Navy. It shattered the confidence that had fueled their early war victories, replacing it with the grim realization that American innovation and industrial might would inevitably prevail. The Germans learned from the Japanese experience, albeit too late to avert their own calamities. In 1943, attempts by U-boat forces to engage in surface combat with aircraft resulted in catastrophic losses, effectively breaking the back of the submarine campaign and forcing them to operate submerged, where they were slow and increasingly vulnerable to detection. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, Italian naval forces could only watch helplessly as Allied aircraft systematically dismantled their operational capabilities, reducing the once proud Regia Marina to a coastal defense force incapable of projecting power beyond the reach of land-based fighter cover. Admiral Kimura, who survived the battle despite his wounds, spent the remainder of the war engaged in increasingly desperate operations. However, he never forgot those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea, when he learned that everything the Imperial Navy had taught about naval warfare was rendered obsolete. He understood that 8 forward-firing machine guns on a modified bomber could achieve what entire squadrons of torpedo planes might fail to accomplish. He recognized that the Americans had found in Paul Papygun and General George Kenney the perfect synergy of innovation and determination to revolutionize aerial warfare against shipping. The statistical data from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea only presents a partial picture. 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers were sunk, resulting in approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors killed. In contrast, Allied losses amounted to 4 aircraft and 13 aircrew. However, these figures fail to capture the revolution in military thinking that the battle embodied. It provided definitive proof that air power had superseded sea power. It demonstrated that a bomber modified in a field depot could be more effective than a destroyer constructed in a major shipyard. It illustrated that innovation and adaptation could triumph over tradition and doctrine. Within the broader context of World War II, the B-25 Strafers epitomized American ingenuity at its finest. They took an existing aircraft and transformed it into something its original designers never envisioned, solving each technical challenge through practical experimentation rather than protracted development programs. These field modifications yielded results that would have taken years to achieve through conventional channels, showcasing a flexibility and adaptiveness that proved decisive in winning the war. They turned the tide in the Pacific through innovations such as skip bombing and concentrated forward firepower. The final Japanese transport to succumb in the Bismarck Sea, the U-Maru, went down on the evening of March 3, 1943. Torpedoed by American PT boats that found her adrift and abandoned, her crew had already been evacuated by destroyers that were themselves fighting for survival. As she slipped beneath the waves, she carried with her not only desperately needed supplies and equipment for Leh, but also the Imperial Navy's diminishing confidence in its ability to protect convoys, maintain sea lanes, and wage the kind of war for which they had trained. This was replaced by the harrowing knowledge that the Americans had fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. The success of the B-25 Strafers influenced aircraft development globally, as air forces recognized the immense value of concentrated forward firepower for ground attack missions. This led to the development of aircraft like the Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik, characterized by its heavy armor and potent armament, the British Hawker Typhoon, equipped with rockets and cannon, and eventually jet aircraft, such as the American A-4 Skyhawk and A-7 Corsair II. These aircraft carried forward the tradition of low-altitude attack capabilities, delivering devastating firepower against surface targets, all tracing their conceptual lineage back to those modified B-25s over the Bismarck Sea. For the pilots who participated in the Bismarck Sea mission, the battle became the defining moment of their war. It was the day when all their training culminated in flawless execution. Months of practice against the Puth wreck paid dividends as bombs skipped precisely as intended into Japanese hulls. Countless hours of gunnery training translated into streams of 50 caliber rounds that swept enemy decks clear in mere seconds. They proved that, when properly equipped and trained, air crews could dominate surface vessels regardless of their defensive capabilities. The maintenance crews, who had worked around the clock to modify the B-25s, installing gun packages, reinforcing structures, and extending blast tubes, solving each challenge as it arose, could take immense pride in knowing that their innovations had performed exactly as intended. The aircraft they had transformed from standard bombers into Strafer gunships had operated flawlessly under combat conditions, their field modifications proving more effective than anything produced on factory lines. A testament to American mechanical ingenuity and practical problem-solving. In Japan, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was etched into military history as one of the war's gravest disasters. It was studied in staff colleges as a prime example of how technological surprise could negate numerical and tactical advantages. How a failure to anticipate enemy innovations could lead to utter catastrophe, and how rigid adherence to traditional doctrine could blind commanders to emergent threats. These lessons would profoundly influence Japanese military thinking for generations, emphasizing the critical need for flexibility and adaptation in the face of evolving technology. The iconic photograph from the battle, captured from one of the attacking B-25s, depicts a Japanese destroyer desperately maneuvering to evade incoming bombs, while streams of 50 caliber tracer fire arc across the water towards it. The sea surrounding the vessel is pockmarked with splashes from near misses, and smoke billows from fires ignited by incendiary rounds, all encapsulating in a single frame the overwhelming nature of the assault. The sheer concentration of firepower rendered defense impossible, signifying the revolution in naval warfare that transpired within those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea. General Kenny would later articulate that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated his deeply held convictions about air power. It proved that bombers could control sea lanes more effectively than navies, that innovation and adaptation could overcome material disadvantages, and that his air crews, given the appropriate modifications and tactics, were capable of achieving anything. This unwavering confidence fueled continuous innovation throughout the war, establishing the 5th Air Force as one of history's most effective tactical air forces. Built upon the foundation established by PP Gun's modified B-25s, the Japanese Navy's response to the Bismarck Sea disaster was to effectively cease daylight convoy operations within range of Allied airfields. They shifted to utilizing submarines and fast destroyers for nighttime runs, a tacit admission of their loss of control over the sea lanes. It signified that air power had triumphed over sea power, and that the traditional naval strategies that had served Japan for decades were rendered obsolete by American innovation. This belated recognition, while unable to alter the war's ultimate course, significantly influenced naval thinking worldwide. As the war progressed and B-25 Strafers continued their devastating campaign against Japanese shipping across the Pacific, the modifications pioneered by Poppy Gun became standardized. North American aviation incorporated 8 gun noses into production models, added enhanced armor protection for low-altitude operations, improved ammunition feed systems to prevent jams during sustained firing, and strengthened structures to withstand the stresses of repeated strafing runs. This evolutionary process was guided by combat experience gained from the Bismarck Sea and subsequent engagements. The human cost of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was staggering for Japan. Beyond the 3,000 soldiers and sailors lost, the toll included irreplaceable experienced crews, trained infantrymen critically needed at Leh, and destroyer captains who had survived the harrowing night battles of the Solomons only to perish in the Bismarck Sea. These were losses that Japan, with its limited manpower reserves, could ill afford. In contrast, the Americans lost 13 airmen, a ratio that starkly demonstrated the overwhelming advantage of properly applied air power against surface vessels, a lesson that would be repeatedly observed throughout the Pacific War. In the aftermath of the battle, Allied intelligence intercepted Japanese communications, expressing profound shock at the comprehensiveness of the destruction, the efficacy of the low-altitude attacks, and, most critically, the inability of traditional naval defenses to counter the novel tactics. One Japanese admiral was reportedly quoted as stating that the Bismarck Sea had unequivocally demonstrated that the era of the surface warship operating independently of air cover was over. This realization, though arriving too late for the Imperial Navy, would influence naval development worldwide for decades. The B-25 Strafers continued their operations until the war's conclusion. Their resounding success at the Bismarck Sea established them as one of the Pacific's most feared weapons. Japanese sailors were reportedly known to abandon ship at the mere sight of low-flying Mitchells, rather than face the devastating firepower they delivered. This psychological impact amplified their effectiveness, rendering them weapons of terror as much as instruments of destruction. Their distinctive silhouette, with the solid nose packed with guns, became an enduring symbol of American air dominance. The technical innovations that enabled the B-25 Strafers were remarkable. From the blast tubes that prevented muzzle flash damage to the reinforced mounting points capable of absorbing the recoil of 850 caliber guns firing simultaneously, these represented American industrial problem-solving at its apex. They took an existing design and meticulously adapted it to meet emergent challenges, resolving each issue through practical development programs, achieving results that would have taken years through conventional channels. For Admiral Kimura, wounded and observing from the deck of the Shikami as his flagship Shiryuki sank stern first into the Bismarck Sea, the 15 minutes of the main assault must have felt like an eternity. He watched helplessly as transport after transport was torn asunder by bombs and gunfire, as destroyers that had endured the hellish night battles of the Solomons were overwhelmed by daylight aerial assault. He witnessed how everything he had learned about naval warfare proved utterly useless against an adversary that had irrevocably changed the rules of engagement, transforming bombers into gunships capable of annihilating a convoy faster than traditional naval forces could react. The repercussions of the Bismarck Sea engagement echoed far beyond military strategy. Dispatches detailing the utter annihilation of a Japanese supply fleet began to filter through to the American populace, conveyed via meticulously vetted news bulletins. These reports lauded the ingenuity and bravery of American aviators, while deliberately obscuring the grim reality of vanquished survivors perishing in the ocean. Such narratives served to bolster spirits domestically and invigorate the sale of war bonds, offering concrete evidence of American triumphs. They demonstrated that ingenuity and resolve could vanquish the adversary, and that conquest in the Pacific was not merely a conceivable outcome, but an assured destiny. In Germany, the Kriegsmarine studied the Bismarck Sea conflict with mounting apprehension. They perceived that if comparable strategies were deployed in the Atlantic, their U-boats, caught exposed on the surface, would face the same perilous fate as the Japanese destroyers. This realization spurred intensified efforts in snorkel technology, a development intended to enable submarines to remain submerged for prolonged durations. Furthermore, New doctrines emerged, advocating for immediate submerged dives at the initial indication of aircraft, forsaking any notion of engaging in surface combat. These were hard-won lessons from the Japanese predicament, though ultimately applied too late to avert the devastating losses sustained by U-boat forces in 1943. The Italian Navy, already grappling with severe attrition from British aerial assaults in the Mediterranean, viewed the Bismarck Sea battle as validation of their deepest anxieties. They concluded that without aircraft carriers and sophisticated radar, surface vessels were virtually defenseless against relentless aerial assaults. The age of the battleship and cruiser as arbiters of naval dominance was drawing to a close, supplanted by aircraft capable of projecting power from beyond the horizon with annihilating efficiency. This dawning awareness prompted increasingly desperate maneuvers to evade confrontation, aiming to preserve the remnants of their fleet. The enduring impact of Pappy Gunn and his modified B-25s persisted long after hostilities ceased, shaping aircraft design and tactical frameworks globally. His principles of ground assault, emphasizing the concentration of maximum forward firepower, suppressing enemy defenses through overwhelming volleys, and deploying ordnance at minimal range for peak precision, remain relevant to this day. These were principles forged in the crucible of the Bismarck Sea, where 8 forward-firing cannons irrevocably altered the trajectory of the Pacific War. This was a time when skip bombing proved superior to torpedo attacks, and when groundbreaking innovation triumphed over entrenched tradition.